My name is Brian McNamara. I'm a solutions architect at Vendia. Vendia is a startup. We got started back in 2020 by Dr. Tim Wagner and Shruti Rao. We like to pitch ourselves as the real-time data cloud. Now let's talk about creating serverless web apps. As Talia mentioned earlier in her talk, it's not uncommon to see like a web application pattern in AWS using services like API Gateway, Lambda, and DynamoDB. And for many organizations, that's a great way to get started and even run for a long time. Now the challenge though comes up where you may need to work with different departments in an organization. You may need to work with different partners outside of your organization. When you need to do that, this model gets a lot trickier. It's harder. What Vendia does is, we basically make it so that whether your partners are running in the same cloud or not, we can accommodate your needs. So using a very simple model, essentially we use JSON schema to define representation of your underlying data. We'll actually provision the necessary resources for each party to interact with this shared ledger. I'll say coming from AWS, AWS is really good at providing Lego blocks, and I don't mean to disparage AWS in any way, shape, or form. AWS is really good at giving you pieces, but leaving the assembly of those pieces to you as customers. We actually take a slightly different approach. We use those same pieces, but we actually put applications behind them. So when you are managing your own infrastructure, I would argue it's hard. You have to do things like provision and manage your infrastructure. You have to do things like creating your API integrations and creating your application code. And when you're talking about working with different parties, authentication becomes a real challenge. If you're working with different parties, you may have concerns about ledgering data as well. So where there may not be a high degree of trust, you may need to prove what happens in your application. Well, that gets hard when you work across multiple parties. So you could build all this yourself, or you can use Vendia Share. Vendia Share makes this really easy. In this lightning talk, I'm going to do a very quick demo, but essentially we view the fundamental unit in Vendia as a universal application. So a universal application allows you to define your participants, who you want to take part in this private permission network, your underlying data model, so your top level types and the properties that comprise those top level types. And within about 5 to 10 minutes, we can actually create a universal application. So in this demo, what I'm going to highlight is the ability to emit data from a Postgres database and have it show up in Salesforce CRM. Now this may be like a good use case for organizations that are looking for, let's say, customer 360 views. They may store data in one source and want to emit it to another. Now in this example, Vendia Share is acting as the connective tissue, but it's by no means limited to just acting as a connector. You actually do have the ability to use Vendia as a primary data store, as many of our customers do currently. So with that, I'm going to jump out. In this example, I am running a Vagrant Docker image, and I have a database. Actually, so in this case, I have an account contact table that doesn't yet have anything in it. If I jump into Salesforce, there are 3 different accounts that I'm working with. These are default, like developer Salesforce accounts, so nothing magical here. There are 3 accounts, University of Arizona, United Oil and Gas Corp, and pyramid construction. Now these are all just using default contacts, nothing special here. But what I have is a SQL file that I'm just inserting values. So 3 separate contacts across 3 separate organizations. If I run the SQL script insert data, I actually have triggers and functions that are associated with that Postgres DB. So what's happening behind the scenes is it's using the native capabilities of the relational database and publishing it out to a Vendia share uni or universal application. That uni in turn has multiple participants. So in this case, I have 2 parties that I'm working with, one to represent Salesforce and one to represent Postgres. So one for Postgres and one for Salesforce. This universal application is actually storing data in it. So if I run a GraphQL query now to list all of the contacts there, I can see that I now have results. More importantly, I can go back to Salesforce and see that I now have contacts that I didn't prior. So I'm picking on 3 of my colleagues here, Vikrant, Francine, and James. Vikrant has been added to the University of Arizona. Francine has been added to Pyramid. And James has been added to United Oil and Gas. Now, it's not just great for adding data, but if I needed to actually keep the data in sync, what I can do is run updates. So if I look at my update script, essentially I'm changing the email address to, I'm adding plus updated. If I go ahead and run that update SQL script, I can see that the 3 updates are made. In my universal application, I can run a GraphQL query and see, in fact, that once consensus runs, the email has been updated across all, well, in this case, 1 party, but let's give it another second, 2 and 3. Now, if I jump back over to Salesforce and I refresh, now this is jgmarginis@uog.com. If I refresh, I should get jgmarginis plus updated. So in this case, I'm doing change data capture from within my universal application, allowing different parties to get a single update from one source. Similarly, if I go ahead and run a delete, here I'm just removing 2 of the contacts. I'm removing James and Francine, leaving Vikrant. So if I go ahead and run that, I can go ahead and see 2 of the entries have been removed. I can jump back over to my universal application, run a GraphQL query against my node, in this case Postgres, and see that, in fact, Vikrant is the only one that remains. So in this way, this is a really, really simple example, but you have multiple parties that can work together using different, using APIs that they own. If we look at the resources that are created for each party, they each have their own API endpoint. They have they each have their own auth mechanism. They each have their way to event data or emit data to other downstream services. All this done from a very, very simple data model. So I would encourage you, we do have this up on GitHub. If you want to take a peek, all these resources are created from this underlying data model. I have a top-level type account contact. Everything that you're seeing is tied back to a serverless application and this underlying data model. I'd love to chat with you more if anybody has any questions about using Vendia Share, how other customers are using Share to provide single sources of truth across disparate parties. I'd love to hear if anybody has any questions.